The antiseptic hum of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital usually acted as a balm for Elara's frayed nerves, but tonight the fluorescent lights flickered with a rhythmic, pulsing cadence that felt like a warning. It was the night of the supermoon. The wolf moon, as the veteran nurses whispered in the break room with uneasy laughs. For Elara, a first-year surgical intern, it just meant a surge in psychiatric holds and bizarre lacerations that defied the physics of urban accidents. She wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, her cheap polyester scrub sticking to her skin. The ER was a pressure cooker, and she was at the center of the steam. The double doors of the ambulance bay hissed open, admitting a gust of unnaturally cold air, and a gurney carrying a man who looked like he had been run through a wood chipper. The paramedics were pale, their hands shaking as they shouted vitals that didn't make sense, a body temperature of 106 degrees and a heart rate that topped 200 beats per minute. "Clear the way," a voice boomed, cutting through the cacophony like a blade through silk. Dr. Julian Vane, the head of trauma surgery, stepped into the light. He was the hospital's golden boy, the youngest department head in St. Jude's history. A man whose surgical hands were rumored to be insured for 8 figures. But as he approached the gurney, Elara noticed the way his nostrils flared, a predatory twitch that seemed out of place in a sterile environment. His eyes, usually a cool, detached gray, seemed to catch the overhead lights and reflect them with a dull, metallic sheen. "Intern, with me!" Julian snapped, his gaze landing on Elara for a fraction of a second. The jolt she felt was immediate, a physical strike of heat that started in her chest and radiated to her fingertips. It wasn't just attraction. It was a recognition, a cellular-level awareness that made her breath hitch. She followed him into Trauma Room 4, the air inside already thick with the scent of copper and something musky, like wet fur and crushed pine needles. As they worked to stabilize the patient, Julian's movements were a blur of supernatural precision. He didn't use a robotic assist. He didn't need one. His fingers moved with a grace that seemed to anticipate the bleed before it happened. But Elara was watching closer than the others. She saw the way his veins pulsed thick and dark against his forearms, and the way he ground his teeth, a low, guttural vibration emanating from his chest that sounded less like a hum and more like a suppressed snarl. "Pressure, Elara!" he barked. She stepped in, her gloved hands pressing down on the patient's shattered ribs. Her skin brushed Julian's forearm, and the world tilted. A vision flashed through her mind. Dark woods, the taste of iron, and a pair of glowing amber eyes looking down at her with a terrifying, ancient hunger. She gasped, her knees buckling. "Focus!" Julian hissed, his hand steadying her arm. His grip was like iron, the heat of his palm searing through her layers of clothing. For a moment, their eyes locked, and the gray in his irises dissolved into a swirling, molten gold. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the cold, professional mask of a surgeon. The patient survived, but the mystery only deepened. After the shift, while the rest of the staff slumped toward the coffee machine, Elara found herself drawn toward the restricted pharmacy wing. She had seen Julian pocket a small, unlabeled amber vial during the chaos, a substance not listed in the patient's digital chart. She found him in his private office at the end of a dimly lit corridor. The door was cracked, and the sound coming from within made her blood run cold. It was the sound of something breaking, heavy wood snapping like dry twigs. She pushed the door open. The office was a wreck. A heavy mahogany bookshelf had been shoved aside, and Julian was slumped against his desk, his back to her. His shirt was torn at the seams, revealing a back corded with muscle that seemed to ripple and shift beneath his skin. He was staring at the amber vial, his hand trembling so violently he could barely hold it. "Dr. Vane? Julian?" she whispered. He spun around and Elara recoiled. His face was a mask of agony, his jaw set in a jagged line. The scent in the room was overwhelming now. Wild, untamed, and intoxicating. I told you to leave, Elara, he growled, the words sounding more like a threat than a warning. The moon, it's too strong tonight. The suppressant isn't working. What are you? She asked, her voice trembling, though she didn't move toward the door. I am the nightmare that keeps the city safe from other nightmares, he said, stepping into a shaft of moonlight that pierced through the office window. I am the alpha of the North Woods pack, and I have spent 15 years trying to bridge the gap between my nature and my calling. This medication, it's a synthesized silver derivative. It poisons the wolf to keep the man in control. But tonight, the wolf wants you. Elara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. She should have been terrified, but the hook she felt was deeper than fear. She realized that every time she had seen him in the OR, he wasn't just saving lives. He was atoning. He was using his heightened senses and preternatural speed to do the one thing his kind usually couldn't: preserve life. You're killing yourself with that medicine, she realized, looking at the vial. The tremors, the fever. It's silver poisoning. A small price to pay, he said, his voice dropping to a low, husky register. He was inches from her now, the heat radiating off him like a furnace. But then you walked into my ER. I smelled you before I saw you, Elara. You aren't just an intern. You're the reason the wolf is screaming to break the cage. He reached out, his long fingers hovering just inches from her throat. Every alpha has a mate, a soul tether. I thought I could outrun mine by burying myself in medicine. I thought if I stayed in the light of the hospital, the darkness wouldn't find me. Elara didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch, her skin finally meeting his. The contact was an explosion of sensory information. She felt his history, the burden of the pack, the loneliness of his dual life, and the sheer, overwhelming protective instinct he felt for her. You don't have to choose, she whispered, her hands finding the hard planes of his chest. The man is the one who chose to be a doctor. The wolf is just the strength he uses to do it. You don't need to poison yourself to be good. Julian. The kiss that followed was a collision of two worlds. It was the sterile, ordered world of the hospital crashing into the raw, primal energy of the forest. Julian groaned, a sound of pure surrender, as he pulled her against him, his hands tangling in her hair. It was a claim, a promise, and a prayer all at once. But the moment was shattered by a sharp rap on the glass of the office door. Standing there was Dr. Marcus Thorne, the chief of medicine, and Julian's longtime rival. Thorne's eyes were narrowed, his gaze darting from the disarray of the office to the amber vial on the floor. Julian, Thorne said, his voice dripping with false concern. I heard a disturbance, and I see you've brought an intern into your private struggles. I've always wondered how you maintained such a high success rate, and why your blood work always comes back with such anomalous results. Thorne stepped into the room, his eyes lingering on the silver-tinted suppressant. If the board were to find out their star surgeon was self-medicating with unapproved substances, or worse, that he was something less than human, it would be the end of St. Jude's, and the end of you. Julian stepped in front of Elara, his posture shifting into something predatory. The low growl returned, vibrating through the floorboards. Careful, Marcus. You're treading on ground you don't understand. Oh, I understand plenty, Thorne sneered. I've been tracking the animal attacks in the city. I know they stop whenever you're on shift. You're a monster playing at being a god, and now I have proof. Thorne turned to Elara, his expression softening into a manipulative mask. Or step away from him, Elara. He's dangerous. Come with me, and we can ensure your career survives this scandal. Elara looked at Julian. She saw the man who had spent his life in a self-imposed prison of silver and silence to save strangers. Then she looked at Thorne, a man who would destroy a savior to satisfy his own ego. He's not a monster, Elara said, her voice echoing with a newfound strength. She reached out and took Julian's hand, her fingers interlacing with his. He's the best doctor this hospital has, And if you want to go to the board, go ahead. But you'll have to explain why you've been withholding life-saving research on cellular regeneration, which is exactly what Dr. Vane and I have been testing tonight. It was a bluff, a desperate surgical-level lie, but it gave Thorne pause. In the silence that followed, Julian's golden eyes flickered with a mix of amusement and fierce, burning love. "Get out, Marcus," Julian said, his voice now a calm, terrifying rumble. "Before the moon fully rises." Thorne retreated, the cowardice beneath his ambition finally showing. As the door slammed shut, Julian turned back to Elara, his breath warm against her forehead. "You lied for me," he whispered. "I protected my partner," she corrected. "But we have a problem. The silver is killing you, and Thorne won't stop. We need to find a way to balance the wolf without the poison." "We?" Julian asked, a small, rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm an intern," Elara said, a mischievous spark in her eyes. "I'm here to learn, and I think I just found the most interesting case study in medical history." As the supermoon reached its apex, bathing the room in a silver light that no longer felt like a threat, Julian pulled her back into his arms. The hospital hummed around them, a city of steel and glass, but in the quiet of the office, the forest had finally come home. The surgeon had found his soul, and the wolf had finally found its mate. Together, they would navigate the thin line between science and myth, rewriting the rules of what it meant to be human, and what it meant to love. The days following the confrontation with Thorne were a blur of high-stakes surgery and midnight chemistry. The silver suppressant sat on Julian's desk like a coiled snake, its amber glow a constant reminder of the toxin eroding his nervous system. Elara watched him during a grueling 12-hour neuro-repair. His hands, usually as steady as granite, had developed a microscopic tremor that only she noticed. "The half-life is shortening," she whispered as they scrubbed out, the water hissing against the stainless steel. "Your body is building a resistance to the silver, Julian. You're increasing the dosage to compensate, and it's melting your peripheral nerves." Julian stared at his reddened palms. "If I stop, the shift becomes involuntary. I can't be a surgeon if I'm a beast, Elara. St. Jude's needs the doctor, not the wolf." "Then we find a biological bypass," she said, her eyes burning with the fierce intelligence that had made her the top of her class. "Werewolf physiology isn't magic. It's hyper-accelerated cellular regeneration triggered by hormonal spikes. We don't need to poison the wolf. We need to trick the endocrine system. They began their work in a disused basement lab, originally designed for pathology, but forgotten in the hospital's latest renovation." Under the cover of advanced trauma research, Elara began harvesting Julian's blood. The samples were unlike anything she'd ever seen under a microscope. Where human cells divided with a measured, rhythmic pace, Julian's were a riot of activity. They didn't just heal. They sought out damage with predatory intent. "Look at this," Elara said, pointing to the monitor. "The silver is binding to the hemoglobin, starving the cells of oxygen just enough to keep the shift hormones from reaching the threshold. It's like trying to stop a flood by choking the river with lead." "What's the alternative?" Julian asked, leaning over her. His scent, cedar and ozone, filled the small space, making Elara's pulse skip. "An enzyme," she replied. "Specifically, a synthetic version of the omega protein found in certain deep-sea organisms that survive extreme pressure. If we can stabilize it, we can create a molecular buffer that absorbs the surge of adrenaline and cortisol without the neurotoxicity of silver." For weeks, they lived on the hospital cafeteria coffee and stolen moments of intimacy between shifts. The research was a dance of biology and instinct. Julian provided the raw data of his shifting biology, and Elara provided the scientific framework to harness it. But Thorne was watching. He began auditing their supply requests, questioning the requisition of high-grade centrifuges and rare amino acids. "He's closing in," Julian warned one evening, his eyes flashing gold as a distant siren wailed, a sound that always grated on his heightened senses. He knows we're close to something." "Then we test it tonight," Elara said, holding up a syringe filled with a clear, shimmering blue liquid. "The Vane-Elara protocol," It's a targeted neurotransmitter blocker. It doesn't kill the wolf, it just keeps the gate closed. Julian looked at the needle, then at her. If this fails, Elara, if the wolf takes over without the silver to dampen it, I won't be able to stop. You have to promise me you'll leave the room. I'm not leaving you, she said, her voice like iron. The moon was 3/4 full, hanging like a sickle over the hospital's glass towers. Julian sat in the center of the lab, his shirt discarded. The muscles in his shoulders were already beginning to bunch and ripple, the skeletal transition beginning in his jaw. Elara injected the blue serum directly into his carotid artery. For a moment, Julian screamed, a sound that started human and ended in a bone-shivering howl. His skin turned a bruised purple and his claws extended, gouging deep furrows into the metal lab table. Elara held her breath, her hand resting on his trembling shoulder, refusing to let go even as the heat from his skin threatened to blister her palm. Then the cooling began. The frantic thudding of his heart slowed to a powerful rhythmic beat. The elongated shadows of his face retracted. The gold in his eyes remained, but the madness, the frantic, feral hunger, receded into a calm, predatory focus. Julian exhaled, a long, shaky breath. He looked at his hands. They were human, strong, steady, and, for the first time in years, free of the silver-induced tremors. I can feel him, Julian whispered, his voice deep and resonant. The wolf is right there, beneath the surface. But he's quiet. He's not fighting me. He's waiting. The serum isn't a cage, Elara realized, tears of relief pricking her eyes. It's a truce! The lab door burst open. Thorne stood there, flanked by 2 security guards and a tablet displaying the hospital's unauthorized research logs. I have you now, Julian, Thorne gloated. Illegal human experimentation. Theft of hospital resources. You're finished. Julian stood up, his height dwarfing the room. He didn't look like a monster, but he looked like something more than a man. The gold in his eyes was steady, a beacon of controlled power. Actually, Marcus, Elara said, stepping forward and handing Thorne a printed report. This is the documentation for the Vane-Elara synthetic enzyme. It's a revolutionary treatment for hyperadrenal disorders and chronic nerve regeneration. We've already filed the patent under St. Jude's name, with Julian as the primary donor and me as the lead researcher. Thorne's face went ash pale as he scrolled through the data. It was flawless. It wasn't a confession of lycanthropy. It was the most significant medical breakthrough of the decade. You can't prove, Thorne started. We can prove everything, Julian interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of an alpha. And if you want to be the man who tried to shut down the cure for degenerative nerve palsy because of a personal vendetta, be my guest. But I think the board would prefer a press conference. Thorne retreated, his career effectively neutralized by the very brilliance he tried to destroy. In the silence of the lab, Julian pulled Elara into his arms. The silver was gone from his system, replaced by a vitality that made him radiate life. You saved me twice, he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. Once from the dark, and once from the cure that was killing me. We're a team, Dr. Vane, Elara smiled, leaning her head against his chest, listening to the powerful, steady heart that beat for both the man and the wolf. The surgeon and the intern, the wolf and his mate. The hospital won't know what hit it, Julian laughed, the sound warm and free. As the sun began to rise, the 2 of them stood at the window, looking out over the city they both served. The secret was no longer a burden to be hidden in the shadows. It was the foundation of a new era of medicine, and a love that was, quite literally, legendary. The boardroom of St. Jude's Memorial was a sanctuary of glass, mahogany, and stifling tradition. High above the city, the walls were lined with oil paintings of stern men in white coats, pioneers who had conquered polio, mapped the heart, and established the hospital as a bastion of logic. Today, those portraits seemed to stare down with particular judgment at Elara and Julian. At the head of the long table sat the board of directors, 5 formidable figures whose collective nod could fund a wing or end a career. Beside them, looking like a man who had already tasted victory, was Marcus Thorne, and he had spent the morning whispering about unauthorized biologics and ethical breaches, poisoning the well before Julian and Elara even stepped inside. Julian stood at the front of the room. He wore a charcoal suit that struggled to contain the raw power of his frame, but his hands, the hands that had once trembled from silver toxicity, were as steady as the foundation of the building itself. "Members of the board," Julian began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that commanded instant silence. "For years, St. Jude's has led the world in trauma recovery, but we have reached a plateau. We treat the symptoms of nerve degeneration and adrenal collapse, but we have never mastered the trigger, the biological switch that tells a cell to repair itself at an accelerated rate. And you claim to have found this switch in a basement lab," said Dr. Vane. One of the directors, a sharp-featured woman named Dr. Eris, asked skeptically, "Without a peer-reviewed trial? Without oversight?" "With my oversight," Elara stepped forward. She felt a flicker of nerves, but then she felt Julian's presence behind her, a steady, warm hum of energy that grounded her. "I am the lead researcher on the Vane-Elara protocol. We didn't seek oversight because the data was too volatile, and the source material was unique." Thorne leaned forward, a predatory smile tugging at his lips. "Unique? Tell them, Elara. Tell them whose blood you are using. Tell them about the anomalies that Dr. Vane has been hiding for a decade." Elara didn't blink. She clicked a remote, and the massive screen behind her flared to life with a side-by-side comparison of cellular structures. On the left, a standard human neuron. On the right, a cell that glowed with a faint, iridescent blue hue. "This," Elara pointed to the right, "is the result of the synthetic enzyme we've developed. We call it Lyc-01. It is a peptide chain that mimics the extreme regenerative properties found in certain apex predators." "Apex predators?" Dr. Eris leaned in, her skepticism turning to clinical curiosity. "The biology of the wolf," Julian said, stepping into the light. He didn't say werewolf, but the weight of the word hung in the air for those who knew how to listen. Specifically, the way the lupine endocrine system manages massive trauma. By synthesizing the enzyme that bridges the gap between the adrenal surge and the healing response, we have created a buffer. It allows for 400% faster nerve regeneration without the systemic shock that usually kills a human patient. "It's a fraud." Thorne stood up, his face reddening. "They're talking about mythology. They're using hospital funds to chase fairy tales." "Is it a fraud, Marcus?" Julian asked quietly. He walked toward the table and picked up a surgical scalpel. Before anyone could gasp, he drew the blade across his palm. A deep, red line bloomed. The board members gasped, leaning back. Thorne sneered. "Self-mutilation won't save your career, Julian." "Watch!" Julian commanded. Elara stepped forward and pressed a small, clear patch soaked in the blue serum against his palm. For 30 seconds, the room was silent. Julian's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing a brief, controlled gold. A flicker so fast most of the board missed it, thinking it was a trick of the light. When Elara peeled back the patch, the wound was gone. Not scabbed over. Not scarred. Gone. The skin was as smooth as if the blade had never touched it. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Even Thorne stumbled back, his mouth hanging open. "The Vane-Elara protocol doesn't just treat the wound," Elara explained, her voice ringing with triumph. "It instructs the body to remember its unbroken state. This isn't mythology, Dr. Thorne. This is the future of surgery, and it was developed right here at St. Jude's." The directors looked from the healed hand to the data on the screen. The financial implications alone, the patents, the military applications, the revolution in chronic pain management, were staggering. "Dr. Vane," Dr. Eris said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. "If this is what I think it is, this changes everything. But the source, you mentioned it, mimics a predator. How did you stabilize it? Julian looked at Elara. For a moment, the boardroom faded away. He saw the woman who had looked into the eyes of a monster and saw a man worth saving. He saw the partner who had turned his curse into a gift for the world. We stabilized it with balance, Julian said, his gaze returning to the board. The predator provides the strength, but the human provides the direction. It's a partnership, and it's one that St. Jude's will lead. Thorne tried to speak, but Dr. Eris silenced him with a sharp wave of her hand. Sit down, Marcus. You've been trying to bury a Nobel-level breakthrough because of a grudge. She looked at Julian and Elara. We want a full presentation for the shareholders by the end of the week. And, Elara, I think your internship just became a residency in our new regenerative medicine department. As they walked out of the boardroom, the heavy doors swinging shut behind them, the sterile air of the hallway felt lighter. Julian leaned down, his lips brushing Elara's ear. You were brilliant, he whispered. We were brilliant, she corrected, taking his hand. Now, I think it's time you showed me that other unique source material. Take me to the woods, Julian. I want to see the wolf without the cage. Julian smiled, a true, predatory, and deeply loving smile. With pleasure, Dr. Elara. With pleasure. The drive to the North Woods took them far beyond the reach of the city's amber glow and the constant rhythmic hum of St. Jude's ventilators. Or as the sleek black SUV carved through the winding mountain passes, the air changed, growing thick with the scent of damp loam, ancient cedar, and the sharp, electric crispness of an impending frost. For the first time since Elara had met him, Julian looked truly at peace. He had shed the stifling charcoal suit for a heavy wool sweater and dark jeans, but it was his posture that had shifted most. The tension that usually corded his neck, the physical manifestation of his battle against the silver, had smoothed out. We're crossing the boundary, Julian murmured, his voice vibrating with a subterranean resonance. The pack knows we're coming. They've smelled you on me for weeks, Elara. To them, you're already a legend, the human who cured the Alpha's poison. He pulled the car onto a hidden fire trail, the tires crunching over fallen needles until the forest swallowed them whole. They stepped out into a clearing bathed in the ethereal light of a moon that was nearly full, casting long silver shadows across the mossy floor. From the darkness of the trees, eyes began to blink open. Gold, amber, and pale green, dozens of them. There was no growling, only a profound, heavy silence as the pack emerged. They were massive, powerful creatures that seemed to blur the line between shadow and substance. At their lead was a gray-furred female with a notched ear and a gaze that held the wisdom of a century. Silas, Julian acknowledged, bowing his head slightly. The gray wolf inclined her head in return, her gaze shifting to Elara with a piercing, analytical intensity. They want to see, Julian whispered to Elara. They want to see the balance we found. He walked to the center of the clearing, the moonlight hitting him like a spotlight. He looked back at Elara, his eyes swirling with that molten gold, but this time there was no agony in them, no fear of the beast breaking the cage. Watch, Elara. This is what you gave me. Julian closed his eyes and breathed in deep, drawing the forest air into his lungs. Usually the shift was a violent, bone-snapping ordeal, a war between two species. But now, fueled by the serum they had perfected, it was a symphony. His body didn't break. It flowed. His muscles expanded with a fluid, liquid grace, his skin darkening and sprouting fur the color of a midnight storm. His spine lengthened, his facial features shifting into a regal, predatory snout without a single cry of pain. It was a transformation of pure, unadulterated power. In his place stood a wolf the size of a small horse, his coat shimmering like obsidian under the moon. He was magnificent, a creature of myth brought into the physical world. He stepped toward Elara, his paws silent on the moss, and lowered his massive head. Elara didn't flinch. She reached out, her fingers disappearing into the thick, surprisingly soft fur at his ruff. The heat radiating from him was a living thing, a pulse of pure vitality. I see you, she thought, and she felt the response in her mind. A low, contented rumble that was the wolf's version of a purr. The rest of the pack erupted into a howl, a haunting, melodic sound that echoed through the valleys, announcing that their alpha was whole again. Silas stepped forward, nudging Elara's hand with a cold nose, a gesture of absolute acceptance. Later, as the moon began its descent, Julian shifted back, effortlessly, his human form returning with the same ease as a shadow shortening at noon. He wrapped a blanket around Elara, pulling her close against the chill. The pack will help us with the next phase of the research, Julian said, looking out at the wolves who were now lounging in the clearing like giant, watchful guardians. With their help, we can refine the serum for every pack. No more silver, no more hiding. Elara looked up at him, the man who was a surgeon, a leader, and a force of nature. And what about us? When we go back to the hospital on Monday? Julian smiled, kissing the top of her head. On Monday, we'll save lives. I will teach the next generation that the things we fear, the things we call monsters, are often just the parts of ourselves we haven't learned to heal yet. He looked back at the woods, then at the distant glow of the city on the horizon. But tonight, we just belong to the moon. Under the canopy of the North Woods, the intern and her alpha sat in the quiet of a world finally in balance, ready to face a future that was no longer a secret, but a promise.